Okay, in this video we're going to focus on the plantations in early America. Most of the focus will be in the first few decades of early colonialism. The government, the slaves, the indentured servants that lived on those plantations, the life of the colony and its infrastructure. Most of my references are from Ivor Noel Hume and Myra Kingsbury. So if you want to get one of those books or one of those people, look it up, you can find it, check it out. I also make use of the historical documents that were written at that time in history. This video is a little insight into the location that had the highest number of deaths after the 1622 massacre. Okay, like my other videos, I am going to stay concise and general while leaving room to go more into detail in other videos. Plus, to keep the length down. I'll make a short 5-minute video someday, though. Not today. So here goes. On May 13th, the year 1607, the settlers made it to land that would be called Jamestown Island. Built Jamestown as a walled community with streets lined with houses, a church, and a military storehouse in a central square. By the 1620s, Jamestown became so populated with people they started to move outside the walled area. This new walled area would be referred to as the New Town. Jamestown continued as the central government of Virginia until the year 1699, when the legislature moved to the mainland to the new administrative center building at Williamsburg in Virginia. Now, these houses of Jamestown and the plantation, most of the houses in the area were made of wood. There had been references that it looked like the houses were about to fall down because the wood was so flimsy looking. The houses were lit at night by candlelight and fireplaces, which led to Jamestown catching fire several times. A person would have to really be careful with the fire in those kind of houses. Like Nina Simone says, don't smoke in bed. But Jamestown was not completely abandoned after the fires because it continued as a port through most of the 1700s in America. And eventually the Ambler plantation took up some of the area until the colonial brick mansion burned down 3 times in history until the last time in 1898. The Ambler family plantation dominated the western part of Jamestown Island in the early 19th century. And during the American Revolution, Jamestown became a center of naval and military activity. Jamestown Island was also used in the Civil War. So Jamestown wasn't destroyed and then left there waiting for archaeologists to uncover it. But the area was used for several purposes throughout the decades and centuries. But by the end of the 19th century, a church tower was possibly built in the 1650s, was the only thing left standing in the area. The capital of Virginia moved from Jamestown to Williamsburg in the year 1699. The archaeologist Ivor Noel Hume describes some of the archaeological parlance, which phrases like terminus post quem, in which is the oldest date of something. For example, like when a garden was last disturbed or a well was last filled. Then there's the terminus ante quem, which is deposits formed before a historically datable event, such as building foundations that were partly demolished to make way for construction of a city wall. So, Hume found the 17th century grave sites that were within a historic fenced area. He also found foundations of buildings in the historic Carter's Grove area, which is the plantation that incorporated the land of the early settlements of Martin's Hundred. Carter's Grove was built and completed in the year 1755. Carter's Grove sits on land that was once referred to as Martin's Hundred. In that location, he concluded that much of Martin's Hundred was burned down due to the 1622 uprising massacre. He found some remains of the burned houses and remains of the mutilated dead, and this search would be regarded as a terminus ante quem of March 22, 1622, and the foundations and skeletons of humans that didn't survive past the date of 1622, but lived prior to that. Now, there were case bottles found during the archaeological dig. Well, they called them case bottles because they were in boxes. They were set together in cases, right? These case bottles were used by the settlers before the year 1650s. Before the 1650s. It was the first type of wine glass bottle the early settlers used in Virginia. And in the 1640s, a new shape was imported from England. And a guy named Ralph Wormley had the bottle makers press a seal that had his initials on the seal. But Wormley died in the year 1652, and the latest bottles were not found at the archaeological site of Carter's Grove, which signifies that the archaeological site in Carter's Grove had not been inhabited by those early settlers since then. And of the grave site they found near the remnants of where a fence once stood, the 5 human remains of which were 2 black women and 3 white men with African characteristics, possibly mulattoes that the team originally assumed. And the team also believed that they were victims of a sickness, some contagious sickness. There was a supposed possible married couple who were buried next to each other in the same pattern, while assuming again that one was buried at a time, maybe some years before the other. And the man was black, and the woman with him was either black or mulatto. And evidence shows that at this specific site, the remains of the people of those particular graves most likely didn't live past the year 1650, referring to those bottles. Then there was an isolated grave of a man approximately 60 years old, they assumed, whose remains were poorly preserved. He was another European male with, at first assumed, African traits, but there was a guy named Dr. J. Lawrence Angel who studied anthropology, and he came to the site at the time of the dig, and he concluded that some Europeans sometimes have some of those same characteristics as Africans do. With such old findings, it was hard to tell the exact graves by the time of the decomposition, but it probably meant that the farther site was a slave cemetery, while the others were of the free people. But Hume says that there were only about 300 Africans in Virginia by the year 1650, and at Carter's Grove, they initially thought that they had accounted for a possible 8 out of 8 Africans on that site. The grave that held the 5 contagion victims that were buried together, then the 3 others, possibly related to each other, were buried near the buildings with artifactual evidence of high standards of living. It could be a possibility that the 3 were free people, while the 5 could have been their slaves. With further investigation, Hume and his team learned that there had been at least one free African family living in Martin's 100 parishes by the year 1660. And of the 4 graves of supposed mulattoes, Hume figured that there was a possibility that there was a cohabitation in early America between European and Africans. With further evidence at the archaeological site, they found what they believed was a cellar. In the cellar, they found gold and silver string that was only used in the clothing of those that were associated with the House of Burgesses, or the elite. Eric Klingelhofer found something written by a New York secretary named Van Tienhoven, who in the year 1650 wrote of the houses in Jamestown, those in New Netherlands and in New England. And this is how the letter goes, and this is how he wrote it. Those in New Netherland and those in New England who have no means to build farmhouses, at first, according to their wishes, dig a square pit in the ground, cellar fashion, 6 or 7 feet deep, as long and as broad as they think proper. Case the earth inside all around the wall with timber, which they line with the bark of trees or something else to prevent the caving in of the earth. Floor the cellar with plank and wainscot it overhead for a ceiling. Raise a roof of spars clear up and cover the spars with bark or green sides, so that they can live dry and warm in these houses with their entire families for 2, 3, or 4 years. So yeah, these people are living like halfway underground. It's kind of interesting. And this New York secretary said that these houses were in New England and New Netherlands. So it was a popular thing. So, a lot of the paintings and drawings we have of early Virginia are based off of an assumption. And Martin's 100 did show signs of at least one house that was 7 feet underground. So we don't see a lot of pictures of houses with a roof on the floor, because the house is underground, is what I'm saying. So I don't know how common it was, but it was there, with a roof that was eye level from street view. And Hume assumed that the poor people or new carpenters that didn't have time or the wealth to build something would live there, live in one of those things until they could afford something better later. Although, with the gold and silver string found in the underground house, they supposed it was the home of William Harwood, since by law he was the only person allowed in Martin's 100 to wear gold in his clothes. He was governor of Martin's 100, and he was involved with the council in Jamestown for a short period of time. From the year 1619, it was made law that only these people were allowed to wear gold in their clothing. They believed that the cellar house was possibly the home of William Harwood. They also found a cannonball there, in which the court records Harwood was the only one in the area that owned a cannonball. And with all that evidence, it must be the place of his residence. This concluded that the grave site of the 60-year-old man must have been the governor of Martin's 100, named William Harwood. He arrived on a boat named the Francis Bonaventure in Virginia in the year 1620. He was appointed the governor's council when he arrived in Virginia, but soon asked to take leave because he wanted to put his focus on the Martin Hundred plantation. The Virginia Company was happy that the population was growing and things were getting built up at first, but not until the Indian Massacre, in which changed their proud minds. There's one perspective that in 1620, there was a lot of unpaid dividends and increase of lotteries that made future investors worry. The company debt was, in 1620, the company debt was over 9,000 pounds. There was a need to make things right. I mean, Martin's Hundred was a really big place, and people looked at it as such. Although there had been a lot of negative comments towards Martin's Hundred, so if people wanted to turn things around, this would be a good time to turn things around. But when it rains, it pours sometimes. But Martin's Hundred and other plantations really got some heavy downfall, rain, metaphorically speaking. 78 people were killed in the Martin's Hundred plantation, in which had the highest death count of all the plantations. Houses and buildings were burned, people were killed, and the women were stolen for slavery and ransom, and possibly other things. In 1622, Virginia's Governor Wyatt ordered that a man named Captain Ralph Hamer come and protect and run the Martin's Hundred. It is not known why he was elected, but Hamer and Harwood were in a lot of litigious disputes. Hamer wasn't very kind to the people of the plantation. It was written in a historical document that said, "Absolute power and command in all matters of war over all the people of Martin's Hundred, and to charge and command all the said people in this said hundred, upon pain and death, to obey him upon all such occasions, and to suffer themselves to be ordered and directed by him." So that doesn't sound like a good time, does it? Thanks, Governor Wyatt. But anyways, Harwood was last heard of in court, where he started a new contract with the minister of Martin's Hundred Parish, where he agreed to an annual salary of 2,000 pounds of tobacco and some amount of corn to be paid. Then in April of 1629, in court, there were complaints that Harwood had burdened the people of the plantation since the colony was smaller since the attack. Therefore, Harwood would have to personally pay the parish 1/3 of the tobacco of corn by himself, while the parishioners paid the rest. Now, Harwood was still in control of the affairs and fate of Martin's Hundred at this time, but things weren't going very well. So in the year 1624, King James took over the colony and made it a royal crown company, no longer by the committees of the stockholder. And King James was angry that they didn't have a foothold in the military security, no more than just, and more than just like one cash crop, which was tobacco, and which King James despised, which was said in writing. "I hate tobacco. I hate the smell of it. Can you please smoke outside? Stand 15 feet away from the door." I don't know if the king said that. We don't know too much more of what happened to Harwood. After the massacre of 1622, a lot of people took refuge in different locations, then returned to Martin's Hundred afterwards. We assume Harwood came back by the end of the year, and with a big group of people, although 19 of them died of some contagious diseases within the first 3 months of 1623. We also know that after the 1622 massacre, a lot of people died since all the resources were destroyed by the Powhatan. So everybody's like, what are we going to eat? They burned everything down and killed everything. As far as the whereabouts of Harwood after the massacre, we know that in August of the year 1626, a guy named Robert Adams of Martin's Hundred was in Harwood's house and said that he heard a man named Richard Crocker who accused Ralph Hamer of profiteering and being unfit to serve on the council. So we have this little evidence of Harwood's existence after the Crown's takeover. And another interesting fact is that a month after the 1626 meeting in Harwood's house, Richard Crocker was arrested and put in jail for a month, and his ears were nailed to a board, maybe to the wall. Wow, that's incredible. So you didn't want to be a prisoner in those times. Now, Hume said that at this point, Harwood was not really heard of much from this point. Although people do argue today that whether he was the same as the William Harwood, the son of George Harwood, that married a woman named Eleanor, that had 3 children with him, Joseph, Nicholas, and Samuel Harwood. Or was he referred to as William Haywood, that received 900 acres of land in the mid-1630s? Or was he the man in the grave that Hume found? Another reference says that Harwood could have traveled back to England in the year 1635. Either way, this video is about Martin's Hundred, not Harwood. So, anyways, let's go. So Martin's Hundred was owned by a group of investors, and John Wolstenholme was one of the investors in which the Plantations Administrative Center was named after him, Wolstenholme Town. And Martin's Hundred was recognized as part of the counties included in the House of Burgesses until the year 1634. So archaeologists found slave quarters at the site, which date at a later time than that of the initial settlers in Wolstenholme Town. And Wolstenholme Town only lasted a few short years up until the massacre of 1622, and then it was like gone completely. It was like, we built this town, and now it's gone. Just a few years. Up until the year 1650, the settlers of Martin's Hundred had some hardships. But of those hardships, there was the weather, which was described by John Smith. And he says, "The summer is hot as in Spain. The winter is cold as in France or England. The heat of summer is in June, July, and August, but commonly the cold breezes assuage the vehemency of the heat. The chief of winter is half December, January, February, and half of March. The cold is extreme but sharp. But here the proverb is true, that no extreme long continueth. The winds here are variable, but like the thunder and lightning to purify the air, I have seldom either seen or heard in the era period. From the southwest came the greatest gust, with thunder and heat. The northwest wind is commonly cool and bringeth fair weather with it. From the north is greatest cold, and from the east and southeast, as far from the Bermudas, fogs and rains." This Old English is sometimes hard to read. But anyways, it seems that they had some really hot days in the summer while they had really cold days in the winter. Not mentioning the mild days too much. They had all types of animals in the wild in Martin's Hundred. Deer were the majority, and other animals consisted of possums, raccoons, skunk, red fox, gray squirrel, rabbit, groundhog, rat, mouse, and birds and falcons, and bald eagles, black vultures, turkey, vulture, crows, and numerous other birds and animals. Some of the people that arrived in Virginia were the people that were out of work and unemployed back in England. While there were some elite that made their way, it seemed that everyone was struggling after the year 1622, after the massacre. The indentured servants had it the worst. A man named Richard Frethorne, who was an indentured servant, wrote this: "I have nothing at all, no shirt to my back, but 2 rags, nor no clothes, but 1 poor suit, nor but 1 pair of shoes, but 1 pair of stockings, and 1 cap. I am not half a quarter so strong as I was in England, and all is for want of victuals. For I do protest unto you that I have eaten more in 1 day at home than I have allowed me here to eat for a week." It's so hard to read this Old English. But Richard Frethorne was from East London. He and his family were on welfare in London, and the welfare was called the Poor Relief. And to describe this poor relief, we could start it in the late 1400s in England, when it started to punish and arrest vagabonds. England used to punish and arrest these vagabonds and those who were beggars in the street. Be like, "Hey, bastard, you just standing there? Go to jail." Yeah, that's how they do it back then. In the year 1494, Parliament enacted the Vagabonds and Beggars Act of 1494. They didn't have a police force in early England. They did later, but in early England they didn't. Rather, they had everyone in the community to enforce the law. And with inflation came a wider gap between the rich and poor, and people were forced to know where they stand in society. And those who didn't, were arrested. Be like, you're poor, go to jail. The law said that if they catch any vagabond, idle, or even a person suspected of either, that person would be sent to jail for 3 days, while only fed bread and water. They punished the poor for being poor and lazy or unlucky. And after the vagabond was let out of jail, the person would either have to go find a job or leave the country or go back to home where he came from and stay there. They then created the act of England created the Act of 1576, where they supplied the vagabonds and poor people with work. And 2 years after that, they started the 1578 Act for the Poor Relief, and Richard was one of these people. But Richard was eventually sent to America, And when he got to America as an indentured servant, he wrote letters back to his family. And Richard wrote letters to his parents and his parish. And he begged them to pay off his indenture or send him some food. He was so miserable in the early America. He mentions all the diseases that people catch and many die of, like the bloody flux and scurvy. He tells them that he only eats peas and water gruel, so he is starved. He says that he never seen any deer, but he has seen some fowl, which he was not allowed to catch or eat it. He says he works very hard from very early in the morning until late at day, and for payment sometimes he gets to eat just a mouthful of bread and beef. Many indentured servants beg that they'd rather be in England begging without limbs rather than be on the plantations as indentured servants. Now, I didn't think indentured servants had it that bad, because a lot of these indentured servants made really successful stories, like Anthony Johnson, for example. But we're going to go over a lot of this of the writings of Richard Frethorne, because he describes of what life was like at the time in Martin's Hundred in Virginia. So Richard Frethorne is taking us back in time right now. He wrote that they were scared every day of an attack from the natives, which happened frequently. The natives were attacking them frequently, and he was every day living in fear. And one of the attacks led to the English capturing 2 of the natives as slaves. But Frethorne says that they kind of needed those people as slaves for the reason that many of the people in the colony were sick and weak and dying, and so the slave Indians would help them. It's crazy times it's crazy to live in those times. In his letter, he is begging his family and connections in England to help him. The death rate was so high that he mentions that he came on a ship of 20 people, and half of them are dead already, and a couple more die every hour, he says. Then they sent 4 more men to come live with them, and already 3 of them had died from the group. And then their lieutenant had also died, along with his father and his brother. And he said that last year there were another group of 20 people, and only 3 of them are still alive. So Richard hopes that they at least send some more helpful servants to help with the work. And he says that there's only 32 people left on the plantation, and if they are attacked by the approximate 3,000 natives, they would surely all die. So he mentions how they killed 80 of them in the 1622 massacre, and more will die if they strike once more. So he's like, please send some more people if you can. Send me some food or get me the hell out of here. What crazy times. Frethorne says that there is nothing there to comfort him. He is in complete sadness, and he has no shirt and only 1 pair of shoes, 1 pair of stockings, and a hat. And someone stole his cloak. He asked the person that stole it what he did with it, but he wouldn't tell him. And although they did see the guy that stole his cloak, they seen him on a ship on a different day. And he was on the ship eating a piece of bread with some beef. And they're like, oh, I see what he did with my cloak. He sold it to that dude for some beef and bread and butter. Jag. So the indentured servants were ripping each other off. People were doing whatever they can do to get by. When you got poverty, you got crime. But he says they'll do anything because they were so weak and people were dying. And he mentioned in his letter that he says that the beer in England strengthens and fattens people, unlike the water in the plantations, which does the opposite, which makes them weak. And this water they also wash themselves in, and then they drink from the water that they wash themselves in. So a lot of people were dying from the water, as I mentioned in different videos. And he mentions that he has eaten more in one day in England than he has eaten in a week in the plantation. But they would go to Jamestown sometimes. Traveling was most often done by boat in those days. Jamestown was 10 miles away from the plantation, so they would boat down there. And Jamestown held all the arriving ships unloading whatever merchandise. And they would leave the plantation on a Monday afternoon and arrive in Jamestown by night. And the next day, they would load whatever materials they received onto the boat, then travel back to the plantation around noon again, making their way back to unload the shipment until around midnight the next day. But if it rained with heavy wind, they would just lay in the boat with the little amount of wet bread that they had for themselves. He says, they give us a loaf of bread for 2 men, and if we take a boat and stay for 2 days, but it was hard, and we must lie in the boat the whole while. So I guess if they took a long trip there and did whatever they did for 2 days, they get a loaf of bread between 2 guys. And if it rained, it would be soggy bread. But there was a man named Goodman Jackson who felt bad for Richard, and would let him sleep in the cabin when he came up to Jamestown. And Jackson gave Richard some fish to take with him home, in which he liked better than the peas in the water gruel. Richard said, "Oh, they be very good folks." Richard said, when Richard talked about the Goodman, Jackson, and family, I'm guessing, because he says folks here, so I'm guessing he's meaning there's a bunch of them. Richard said, "Oh, they be very godly folks, and love me very well, and will do anything for me. And he much marveled that you would send me as a servant to the company. He saith I had been better knocked on the head." So this conversation with Jackson and Richard, Goodman was like, "Hey man, you'd be better just like getting beat up in the face than being an indentured servant here." He said that was a bad choice. But Richard learned of the hardship of being an indentured servant, as Jackson had mentioned. And in the year 1623, Richard wrote those letters to his family begging them to take him home. And if they can't afford to bring him home, he asked them if they could gather all their good neighbors together and gather some food and send it to him, because he was starving. He concluded that they were to send letters and whatever else to his friend, the gunsmith in Jamestown named Goodman Jackson. And Goodman would also notify the family if Richard dies. And sure enough, Richard Frethorne died sometime in February of 1624. And he was probably still a teenager at this time of his death. So he was a teenager writing all this stuff. A starving teenager in the early 1600s. So the people of Martin's Hundred didn't have enough to keep themselves healthy, and is the reason why a lot of them died young. They did have enough weapons and armor, though, just in case they were attacked by the natives or the Spanish. It wasn't easy for either the slaves or the indentured servants. In the early years, most of them died before their servitude was completed, as I had mentioned earlier. There were African and European indentured servants, and the African slaves didn't start to replace the European servants until several decades later, in which we will eventually get into that point of history in a different video far from now, because we're going to go slowly through all this stuff. Anyways, that's it for this video. I don't think I need to ask anybody to subscribe or hit the like button. I think a lot of people are a lot of people that see these kind of videos hate this kind of history, so they're probably going to hit the thumbs down button. But whatever, I can't tell anybody what to do. Adios.